That's, welcome to Ecologic for the month of August. Looks like it's a little cooler this August than last August, and we have as our guest Dave Dixon, who will be talking about flood control in Acadiana and what's being done about repeating what happened in August 16, 19, 2000, what?
2016.
2016, 2016. So welcome, Dave. Share with us where we're going, how we've improved the flood control and so forth.
All right, well, thank you, Harold. Today, we're gonna talk about a couple projects plus one effort in coordinating with some other entities that manage water in the watershed. So we'll give everybody a little update as to what's been going on. It's been quite a bit of stuff going on. Been a little lax about getting out some articles regarding them. But today we'll give you a little briefing about what's happening with a couple of these projects. And with that, can we go to the next slide? Okay. And you can go to the next slide. Yeah, the second slide. There we go. All right. Well, the first slides have to do with two meetings we had with Dredge the Vermilion Freshwater District. And we had a meeting in Cot Springs with the district, along with entities from a number of organizations in the state, including CPRA, that's Coastal Restoration, Life and Fisheries. We had representatives from U.S. Representative Higgins' office there. We had council members from Lafayette, council members from St. Martin. We had a number of board of directors from Dredge the Vermilion Freshwater District, along with their executive director, and they're the ones that hosted the meeting. And the gist of that meeting was evidence why we need to have a coordinated response to a threat like a hurricane or a stalled cold front, till we can get as much water out of the system as possible. And these next slides are some hydrographs, a little bit technical, but I'll try to explain them to the audience here, and about what's happening in the river and why we need to minimize the amount of water they send us from the northern and central part of the watershed when we got a storm coming. So you can go to the next slide, David. All right, this is a graph of the level at Louisiana 733 E. Broussard on the southern end of the parish. And the takeaway from this graph is, if you look toward the left side of the graph, where the data starts in 20,008, to the right side where it ends at about 20,022, you'll notice there's a line in the middle of the graph between 5 and 10. That's the flood stage. And you can see how many events exceed the flood stage between 2008 and 2014. But then as you move forward toward 2022, not only do you see more events exceeding the flood stage, you see in higher levels at E. Broussard. Some of these levels are in the danger zone, including the 2016 flood, which is the highest one. And then we had another one that was very, very close. Those three arrows on the right are three individual 100-year floods that happened, 100-year flood levels that happened at E. Broussard after the 2016 flood. So the point I'm trying to make with this slide here is that due to whatever, climate change, development, improvements on Cooley-Ildacon, the water levels, we're seeing higher and higher water levels at E. Broussard now than we did in the past. Can we go to the next slide, David? Oh, you went back to the same slide.
Hang on. They disappear on me completely and I have to go find them one at a time.
Yeah.
Stay on that.
There you go. Okay, this side is a hydrograph. Is a hydrograph of the high water mark survey that was conducted after the 2016 flood. Now, what is a high water mark survey? A high water mark survey is where they send surveyors out with survey equipment and they look for debris lines, watermarks on buildings where they can see how high the water came, and then they get a survey elevation and they map where that site is. Okay, and I might note that that high watermark survey data was supplemented by some gauges that we have on the river, and all the data there you see on that graph was sourced from U.S. Geological Survey data. So this is nothing that we made up or anything like that. The person that put this graph together is one of our board members who's a PhD hydrologist who taught hydrology at UL. Okay. Now the key takeaway from this graph, you'll notice it's like a pyramid, okay? The highest water between Vermilion Bay and Cypress Island Swamp by the airport during the 2016 event happened at the confluence of the river in Couilly-Ile-de-Con, where the water level reached in excess of 20 feet. So you got water running in both directions, because remember, water don't run uphill. So you got water running down toward the bay, but you also have water running toward Cypress Island. And this particular situation is what's causing a lot of the flooding in Lafayette Parish. Flooding along Ile-de-Con and flooding along the river also, because it pushes water backwards. So what happens there is that whenever Couilly-Ile-de-Con has got a good flow, like there's a flood going on up in Scott, it actually blocks the drainage of the river from Lafayette proper. So from the points in Lafayette north of the confluence of Ile-de-Con and the river, the drainage from Lafayette cannot pass there, because what happens, a hydro dam forms there. So next slide, please. All right, this was 2019, where we had 5 12-foot flood at Surrey Street. Now, this is upstream here. Surrey Street gauge, which is probably the gauge most of y'all look at. We had 5 12-foot floods in the first 7 months of 2019. We only had 11 of these floods, 12-foot floods, between 1940 and 1980. They started keeping records in 1940. So in 40 years we had 11, and we had 5 of them in 7 months. Okay. All right. Next slide, please. All right. Now this is again some more evidential data about what's happening at Ile-de-Con. These are the 3 100-year flood events that happened at Ile-de-Con, one in 2019, one in 2020, and one in 2021. And the data at the bottom there is data from Fistemaker's model of Ile-de-Con, showing the expected levels in a 100-year flood at different points along Ile-de-Con. And that highest level, or the one that's highlighted, is down by the river at where Robley crosses Ile-de-Con at the bridge at the parish line right there. So again, you might note that the data, the source data, is all either governmental data or data from a professional engineering firm regarding the levels expected in a 100-year flood event along Ile-de-Con. Okay, so these 3 slides right here are represented. You can stay on that. You stay on that for a minute. These slides represented our evidence of why we can't pass the water beyond Ile de Con during a flood situation. So any water sent from the northern part of the watershed or central part of the watershed is not going past Ile de Con until Ile de Con gives the river some relief and lets the river start to flow from the north. Okay. All right, next slide. All right, in the second meeting we had with Dredge the Vermilion, we had this at their office with some of their board members and the executive director. And we said that we felt that Lafayette's parish representation on the board, which we have one member currently, is not commensurate with the percentage of ad valorem tax payments that Lafayette Parish makes to Dredge the Vermilion Freshwater District. Okay. Just FYI, we make 65% of the ad valorem tax payments to Dredge the Vermilion Freshwater, and we're one of 4 parishes that contribute to their ad valorem tax receipts every year. Another item that we wanted to talk about was that they had reported in their in a session at the Lafayette Parish Council that they had like $20 million worth of capital expenses coming up. And we asked them to take a look at their capital expense plan. And they reported at the second meeting we had with them, they in fact have $50 million for capital expense plans, capital expenditures they plan in the next few years. And they promised to send us a detailed, itemized list of the expenses for those plans. And the last thing we wanted to explore with their board was the investment plan for their accrual accounts. They have around somewhere between $35 to $40 million worth of accrual accounts, cash type accounts on their books as per the Louisiana Legislative Auditor. And we thought that was pretty excessive considering when we compared it to a like organization north of them, the Red River and Bayou Bluff Levee Board in Alexandria, who really has similar types of equipment and maintenance responsibilities for the northern part of the watershed, and Dredge the Vermilion has for the central and the southern part of the watershed. They have around $5 million in their accrual accounts. And they have, well, it depends. On a normal year, their operating expenses are about the same as Dredge the Vermilion. Now, in the last 2 years of drought, Dredge the Vermilion operating expenses were high because they had to run their pumps a lot more than they normally have to run them. I do believe that the record drought that we had for the last 2 years is over. It ended back in January, latter part of January of this year, and we're back into more of a normal pattern. We'll have some dry weather and we'll have some wet weather. And what I mean by that, when we're looking at the utilization of their pumping system since the beginning of the year to the end of July, it was like 6% of their capacity. And now it's probably going up a little bit because we've had a dry spell here in August. We haven't included August numbers in there yet. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Harold for a minute for comments.
Well, you talk about Lafayette's contribution is 65%, and we have one representative. So of the 35 million sitting there, probably 25 million comes from Lafayette.
Right.
Lafayette probably benefits least from this project. The water just goes through Lafayette and is mainly going to irrigate the agricultural needs of Vermilion Parish. It's a program that, is mainly to control water at low water levels. It has nothing to do with flood, and that is a major issue because they keep Bicatable at flood. Flood stage is 19 and they keep it at 18. They keep Baytesh at 10, flood stage is 10. So the whole system keeps a flood in place, so when a flood does come, it has nowhere to go except into your house. So that's a major problem. Then that continuous flood damages wetland in 6 different parishes. So it's a real problem in how that operates. And it operates with a management plan put together by the Mississippi River Commission, and very difficult to change. That is the guidelines, that's the gospel they have to follow. They don't have any local opportunity to vary from those guidelines. It tells them when to pump, when not to pump, and so forth, but the whole plan has nothing to do with flood control. And that is a major problem, because keeping the bayous full and the swamps full means we lose all our retention. So that hopefully will be changed in the future.
Well, related to that issue, during Hurricane Barry, we were able to convince them to shut their pumping down about 5 days ahead of time. And then we got an assist from the hurricane coming in on the right side and blew a lot of water, the remaining water out of the system. And Hurricane Barry had a very significant storm surge of about 12.5 feet at Lehman-Bowman locks, which is a measured value. There's a gauge there. And no one flooded because that storm surge, when that storm surge came in and the rain started, Cypress Island Swamp was dry.
Yeah.
It had drained. Lake Charlotte, I understand, was a mud flat in Cypress Island.
First time it dried up in 35 years.
Cypress Island is enormous retention, okay, enormous, okay. We did some calculations on Cypress Island in some high water events we had in those years when it was raining quite a bit. We had those 3 100-year storms. We had an opportunity in one of those storms where the storm happened and then it didn't rain. So the swamp filled up with water, and really pretty much the only way out of the swamp is through Surrey Street, and there's a gauge there. So we ran some calculations, and based on those calculations, we measured 60,000 acre feet measured for the first 9 foot of elevation in that swamp. Now, I'm not talking about 9 foot gauge level at Surrey. I'm talking about 9 foot, basically sea level. So the swamp raises, floods up to a 9 foot sea level elevation. When it comes out under Surrey, we measured 60,000 acre feet. And as the bowl is shaped in the swamp, the next foot of elevation from 9 to 10 would easily push us up to 10,000, just looking at how the volumetrics change from 5 up to 9. In addition to that, some of the water that's in Cypress Island did go out to Joe Dade Canal during that event, which is unmetered again, so we don't know how much that was. So conservatively, we can say Cypress Island is a huge, huge retention area, natural retention area, I might mention, that really doesn't cost us anything to manage other than making ensure that the water gets to the swamp, okay, when there's a flood that happens. And of course, we need to ensure that the water gets out of the swamp after a flood happens, when the water starts going down. That's gonna be talked about in the next project. But before we go on, I'd like to say, after 8 years of negotiating with Dredge the Vermilion Freshwater District, we at least have a verbal agreement that there will be action on their behalf to reduce their pumping or quit their pumping and reduce the levels in the Bicatable north of us to 15.65, which is the level they operate in December. That's approximately the level we reduced it to during Hurricane Barry, and that saved us, okay? because that let a lot of water out of the system north of us. And I guess the important thing is it lets the water on our end drain before the storm gets here. Because if they keep pumping right up until time the storm gets here to maintain 1761 elevation by Catawba, you know, you're in a flood immediately. Because you haven't let any water out of the system for the most part. You're keeping the system full.
Yeah.
So there at least we got it verbally. Our next step is to get it in writing. And in addition to that, our next step is to get a plan in writing that coordinates all the entities that have their hands on the gate controls, the pump controls, and they can take action when a storm threatens the area. This point was brought up in the first meeting with Dredge the Vermilion when the colonel from the Corps of Engineers was there. And we did get a verbal agreement from the parties over there. There was around 40 people there. We had a lot of affirmative agreement that we need to carry this the next step forward. And that is going to be turned over to the Acadiana Watershed Management Team. Rachel Goudeau with the mayor's office here is supposed to put us on the agenda of their next meeting where we can present to them our ideas for a plan, which was developed some years ago, but it never got formalized and adopted officially by the different parties. Now, just when we talk about different parties, let's talk about who's got their fingers on the controls of pumps and gates. All right, well, number one is the Corps of Engineers. You know, there are floodgates on the levee in north of Henderson. Two floodgates there, one for called the door bone, which is one of the first floodgate that was ever put there, small gate. But then there's a fairly large set of gates on Baia Catawba. And then Dredge the Vermilion. Dredge the Vermilion has a number of gates in the system. And of course, they got their big pumping station in Cot Springs. So what that plan calls for is them to stop pumping. And it also calls for them to start closing certain gates and opening certain gates. They need to close the Ruth Canal gate, which lets water out of Bayou Teche into the Vermilion River. They need to open up the gate on the lock structure on
Laurelville Canal.
Laurelville Canal and let the water go out into Lake Foss Point. Let the water out of Bayou Teche. Okay. And is there any other gates there on their system that they have to deal with?
Yeah, there are other gates. There's gates down in Vermilion Parish that's mainly open to allow water in to irrigate rice fields to the west of the Vermilion Bayou. You have a gate at Orneville, which is not operational. It's just a dam that keeps the water from going down to Vermilion, keeps it high in the Teche, which means a lot more comes through the Ruth Canal than through the Vermilion at Orneville.
At Orneville, right.
Yeah.
But they don't have any control over that.
They have any control of that. It's
Right.
just a restriction. It's an overflow dam, so to speak.
All right. And then on the downside, we have St. Martin Parish controls the gate that maintains the level in Henderson Lake.
And you
Okay.
see, that was a real
So-
problem in the flood of '16, because when the river was at 8 feet and Henderson was around 9, and when they opened the gates to let the flood water in, it filled up in 24 hours. Because the bottom gate, the Rose Gate was closed. That's a big factor. And then all kinds of restrictions in the system. The Dixie pipeline, the actual pipeline that carries the water for Dredge the Vermilion across the system, that's a giant dam across the system. In fact, there's a centrifuge that allows water along the Louisiana Canal to go under the canal that feeds the Dredge the Vermilion water to Baia Catawba. So there's a lot of restrictions in the system. The fact that they generally keep Henderson closed and keep that whole floodway much higher than the river, which means a big loss of retention.
So Henderson Swamp is not really a swamp, it's a lake now.
It's a lake, that's right.
Yeah, it's a lake. The swamp, just, the definition of swamp, Harold knows that.
Well, there's a wetland that rises and falls with the rise and fall of the waters, the receiving water body. And so when you keep it at the same level, it's no longer wetland, it's impoundments. And in that issue, you lose a lot of retention, which causes the flooding.
All right. And then there's also the Red River and Bayou Buff levee board up north of us that opens up gates on Bayou Buff that sends water that ends up down in Bayou Catawba, that ends up in the Vermilion River. And they open that gate up there in Bayou Buff and Bayou Rapides. They get water from the Red River, send it down Bayou Rapides, send it down Bayou Buff for the farmers and the Balls in St. Leonard Parish.
Yeah.
So it also ends, like I say, it also ends up in Bayou Catawba. So anyway, the good news is that we got a verbal agreement to cooperate in lower waters in the event of a threat. The bad news is we don't know who's exactly in charge and who's gonna call it when it actually is a threat. In other words, who's gonna make that decision that a threat exists and at what time? Because everything is timing dependent. To let the water get out of the system before a storm gets here. So with that, I guess we'll go on to the next subject. Do you want to go to the next slide?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So when we talked about Cypress Island, we talked about, it's got to drain whenever it is flooded. And right now there are shoals in the river around Coulee Mean that slow down the drainage of Cypress Island after there is a storm and Cypress Island fills with water. This project mimics pretty darn closely what the Corps of Engineers did in '97 after the flood of '93. Okay, so after 2016, the Corps did 2 surveys on the Vermilion River, and they identified the shoaling of the river. Shoaling in the river. And the shoals at Coulee Mean were the most extreme shoals. Because as Coulee Mean drains from the Karen Crow area, it carries all the siltation in that water, and it comes down there. If you passed over Coulee Mean at the old horse farm, Monkus Park now, you'll notice the velocity of the current in that thing when there's after a big rain event, very, very high. And those things were designed, the concrete line coulees were designed to be self-cleaning. So self-cleaning means everything ends up in the river. So that's why you see the shoals forming at Coulee Mean. They're going to dredge we're going to have a map here in just a minute, or a diagram that the engineers put together on this, about 2,000 foot upstream and 2,000 foot downstream of the confluence of Coulee Mean and the river. Now, strangely enough, they're starting this dredging project on the upstream side, which is the closest area to the spall disposition area, which is going to show also on the diagram. This is a project that's being done by Lafayette Consolidated Government. This is not the Corps of Engineers. And preceding this project, about 3 years ago, the administration, LCG, conducted a survey by Fenstermaker, a third survey that identified all the falling objects in the river, trees, washing machines, cars, a dead body or two, etc. Okay. And they went out there and pulled that stuff out prior to this dredging project. You certainly wouldn't want your dredge boat to get caught up in a washing machine trying to trying to grind up a wash machine and send it to, or a car to send it to the disposition area. And I don't know how many cars and metal objects they had in there, but I do know they had many dumpsters of trees that came out of the river. I went down there while they were doing the project and observed some of this tree debris had been in the water forever, for years and years and years. You could tell, because it was highly degraded. And a tree in a river is a bad thing, because what it does, it traps the silt.
And other branches of the trees, it all collects.
And it's a hazard to navigation too.
Yep.
You know, if you come along there in your boat about 25, 30 miles an hour and you hit a submerged tree, you're liable to break something. Okay? You could actually cause your boat to capsize, you know. So anyway, so let's go to the next slide, and let's get a picture of, okay. Now, the little rectangle on the right side of the drawing is a spoil disposition area. And on the left side, you'll see they drew where the shoals were around Coulee Mean. And you see there's a couple gaps. That's where Coulee Mean deposits its water into the river, and it actually gouges the river out deeper right there, but right immediately upstream and downstream of there, it deposits its silt, and it causes this severe shoaling. Okay. The small disposal area is on some parish-owned property at the end of Jomela Drive, which is down past the Hilton. And you might note that this is on the other side of the Pinhook Bridge. So the dredging project's on the downstream side of the Pinhook Bridge, and the soil disposition area is on the upstream side of the Pinhook Bridge. So when the parish was bidding this thing, I encouraged them strongly to use a hydraulic dredge which pumps the spoil. So if you go down by the river on the Pinhook Bridge, you might look over the side and you'll see a black pipe floating in the river. That's the pipe that the dredge boat is using to pump this slurry that is digging out of the bottom of the river to this disposition area over there by the end of Jomela. Okay, so they built the levee around the disposal area, and that's a dewatering effort over there, and that spoil will not stay there. So after the spoil has been dewatered, and it might take 2 years, it will be trucked out of there, and the land will be restored to its natural level on Jomela. It's kind of hard to see, but in the middle of this, between those trees, is a dredge boat that's on the river right there. And it's there's a picture of it, it's a little closer in. It's a very, very small dredge boat. This is probably a boat that's used to dredge around harbors to remove where it silts up around where boats moor and such like that, which I think there's quite a few of these operations around the United States where if you have a harbor, they have to have dredge boats that service that harbor on somewhat of a regular schedule. This is similar to the dredging operation that was done in St. Martin Parish on Catahoula Lake. Okay, I think the boat there on Catahoula Lake was maybe a little larger than this one, but not a whole lot bigger. And you'll notice it looks like pipes sticking out. That's spuds. I don't know how this boat is propelled, but I suspect it might be self-propelled. The cabin in the front's where the operator sits, and there's a boom that extends to the front of the dredge that is the cutter and suction head. So I think I've got a picture of that on the next slide. So the spud holes, there it is right there's the cutter head. So there's a hydraulic cylinder that lets that thing go up and down. He's turning there and just open water. He might have been flushing his pipe and pumping right here. So the idea is that you can kind of see the teeth sticking up there. It grinds up the bottom, the shoal, into a slurry, and then it sucks that slurry up, dirt, whatever is in there, into that pipe and pumps it down to the disposal area. And they can go, I think they can go about a mile with the existing pump that's on the dredge boat, and then they can put booster stations if they need to, where they can extend the, because they're probably sitting close to a mile away right now, so they're probably gonna have to have a booster when they move down to the other end of Cooley Mean down past Rotary Point there. So it's gonna take a while. That's a pretty small operation. But I pointed out to the parish, I said, if you took they originally wanted to talked about dredging this thing with a bucket dredge or a dragline type operation and barges. But I said, it's gonna be a massive disruption to traffic on that end of town when opening and closing that Pinnock Bridge. How old is that Pinnock Bridge, Harold? You have an idea?
Oh, I think that was built and replaced in the late 50s.
So it's old.
Yeah, it's old. Oh,
It's
yeah.
old. And opening and closing it 100 times to pass a barge under there.
That would cause a traffic jam.
Well, yeah, what's the chances of breaking it? I mean, you
Yeah,
know.
right.
Yeah. Yeah, it probably gets open and closed now, once or twice a year, maybe? Maybe.
Not even once a year
Not even
anymore.
once or twice a year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They used to have a
So,
boat building yard. It would open a lot more often, but that
Yeah.
yard is closed.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think the parish heard me and they decided to utilize a hydraulic dredge on this project, which I think was a very smart move on their part. In fact, if they were using a barge type operation, they couldn't operate. The water level's too low in the river right now.
Right.
They would be stuck in the mud because there's literally the water in the river out there is. Well, if Dredge the Vermilion wouldn't be pumping, it would probably be inches deep. It's only feet deep right
That's
now.
right.
Maybe a foot deep, Harold.
2 or 3 feet.
Yeah,
2 feet, I
2 or
guess.
3 feet
Yeah.
where those shoals are.
Yeah.
So it's not safe to run your boat through there very fast. You're gonna tear something up because you're gonna hit bottom. So anyway, it's good news.
That's good news because it's taking the bumps out and removing the channel restrictions that have a big impact on how much water the Vermilion can carry to the bay.
Right.
So you might share with us too, I know you've been working with the Homewood project, what's going on with that project and
That's the
how
next-
are we gonna go forward?
That's the next project. And any further comments about the spot dredging? I think we're gonna be finished.
No, I think that's a real success to have that
Yeah.
done, yeah.
We named our nonprofit after Dredging the Vermilion. That was our keystone project to get this thing done. Related news on that, there's supposed to be an end-to-end dredging operation mostly taking place in Lafayette Parish because there are a lot of other shoals in the river, but these are the really bad ones, okay?
Yep.
Again, I might say this is what they did after the 93 flood. And I think that was the Corps of Engineers that did that project. So this pretty well mimics, this spot dredge pretty well mimics that. But the Corps of Engineers is supposed to dredge this thing all the way from the Lake Martin Road Bridge down to the Intercoastal Waterway. And
Yeah, most of that dredging will be between Milton and the Lake Martin Road.
right. The problem with that is that that thing was supposed to happen in 24, and then they slipped to 25, and now we don't even know if it's going to get done in 25. So I'm glad we're out there doing the spot dredge. At least we're getting something done. So I guess with that, we'll move on to Homewood. And we'll go to the next slide. Okay, you've seen this slide before here because I used it as part of my evidence about why we need to manage the amount of water that comes to the southern part of the watershed. So what I did, myself and one of the, I guess you could say he's a representative of the Riverwood subdivision next to this pond project, is a retired engineer, And working together, we did some analysis on how much water is in the crest of a 100-year flood event. And what does a 100-year flood event look like at Cooley-Illecon in the river, okay? Well, really, the only thing we got to go by, which is a pretty good go by, is a proxy, which is a gauge that's at Ebrusaar, which is right upstream of the confluence of Illecon and the river, okay? And some takeaways from this graph right here is that you'll notice that each one of these three crest events all look very, very similar. They're all characterized by a very rapid rise, and then a fall off pretty quick too. It falls off pretty quick. The rapid rise from 9 feet, which is the modeled inlet for this pond project they're going to put there, to the crest at right about 14, is very consistent. From 6.5 to, I can't see the numbers from here, about 8 hours. So I think we had a 6.5, a 7, and an 8 in these three 100-year events. So that's very, very similar behavior when a 100-year event occurs on the river there, okay? And again, we did volumetric calculations using proxy gauges, okay? So they estimate the amount of volumes in the crest. And where we were going with that is we were comparing those volumes to the volumes of these ponds that they're building on Illecon, okay? So their idea is to reduce the crest they see in the river by enough to keep from harming people. So we wanted independent calculations that didn't depend on the engineer's models, okay? Again, the gauges we used were proxies, but we feel they were pretty good proxies for what we were trying to calculate. We had to make some assumptions because there are other streams that enter the river north of Perry, which is our proxy gauge for the volumes, okay? So there is a coulee that enters the river right north of Perry called Young's Coulee. You may have seen this coulee if you've driven on Highway 14 in Abbeville, right by the golf course, heading to Kaplan.
Yeah.
Right out of town, you'll see a large coulee, kind of like Illecon.
Yeah.
Okay, that's Young's Coulee. Well, in our research, the watershed on Young's Coulee is actually larger than the watershed on Coulee Illecon. However, it's flatter, so the water probably doesn't hit the river there as hard as it does coming from Illecon. All right, so again, we had to make some assumptions, but the assumptions were, I think, reasonable and based on a fair amount of data. And we did end up with some new gauges at Milton that we were used to calibrate our estimates. And we found that in all three events, the two ponds on the Homewood and the Cooley-Illecon pond project on Duhon Road would lower the crest level by at least a foot, in a couple of cases 2 feet. And the reason there's differences between the two is that one of these events had a fairly major tidal effect. So as you can well understand, the tide this far down the river, the tide greatly affects how well the river drains.
Yep.
So if you have a high tide event, it impedes the drainage. In fact, if you look at that one on the right side, I think you can still see the flood level there. It takes a fair amount longer and slower. Of course, they had a second rain that came in behind that first rain, bumped the level up again. But it takes a while for the water to go down, okay? So, but it rises very, very rapidly. So the idea is to put that rapid rise in the ponds and to cap that crest in the river. That's what gets in people's houses, something below the harm level. Okay, next
Yeah,
one.
a foot doesn't sound like much, but
Yeah, what's-
73% of the homes in those 16 flood had less than a foot. So a foot
Right.
can make a lot of difference.
Yeah. But I think I'll make a point with that graph now. That's a 100-year flood. That's not 2016 event. We don't have any data. Let me talk about that for a minute. All the engineering on these projects, these type of projects in the state of Louisiana, to get funding for these projects from the state, have to be based on a 100-year flood. And that 100-year flood is defined by DOTD in a study that they did of the statewide rainfall patterns. And it's for different areas of the state, it's different numbers, okay? So the engineers have to use that 100-year flood modeling to get their projects approved. Okay, and what you're looking at here, this was the last design review prior to the halt of the project that was done at the request of the LCG when they discovered that there were a lot of pipelines out there that were interfering with digging one large pond. Okay. So we thought this was really, really negative to have a whole series of ponds there. The ponds had to be deepened to be wet ponds. That means you'd have to pump them to get the full capacity. That's very, very expensive. And it's very, very dicey whether or not you could pump them down quick enough in the event of a storm to maintain the full capacity of the ponds, okay? This particular design was like, you can count them as 5 individual pond areas instead of one big pond at the river. That was originally conceived when this project was first put on the table. They were not allowed to get on the property by the landowners to do investigation. They knew there was one pipeline out there. The only pipeline that was shown on the National Pipeline Map System was the Boardwalk Pipeline, which is a utility natural gas pipeline that serves like 8 customers over in Vermilion Parish. The other pipelines were not on the National Pipeline Map. And not being able to access the property, they couldn't determine exactly what was out there. And when they finally did, they discovered they had pipeline all over this property. Okay. So they were trying to design a scheme to not disturb these pipelines, okay? And these extra pipelines. And these extra pipelines were related to wells. And there was an old gas field out there, the Maurice gas field. And there were wells on this property, both production and saltwater disposal wells. And those wells had flow lines, okay? They're really not a pipeline. And you don't need an easement to run a flow line on an oil and gas lease, okay? So they don't have to have like a
Pipeline permit.
pipeline permit and then it get included into the National Pipeline Map, where you could have seen from the web that these things existed. They found them when they started digging. And they realized even though these wells were dead and abandoned, the flow lines were still there. So they were trying to come up with a scheme to go under these flow lines. Well, along the way in our investigation, we discovered that the wells that had been abandoned wells had been categorized as orphan wells. So what is an orphan well? An orphan well is a well that's been turned over
To the state.
for abandonment. In other words, the owner of the well, in this case it was a company called Prayer Oil and Gas, had went out of business, filed bankruptcy, and which seems to be a recurring theme. And the wells were handed over the Department of Natural Resources for abandonment. And the Department of Natural Resources has a grant from the federal government to abandon a certain number of wells per year. So our strategy was to see if we could figure out a way to get these pipelines, these flow lines out of the way to simplify the design of this well. Let's go to the next slide. So we came up with this scheme right here where there's one big pond, which was the original concept, okay? And the one big pond has only one remaining pipeline to deal with, and that's the Boardwalk pipeline, utility gas pipeline. And we've discussed with Boardwalk, they are willing to talk to the parish about allowing the parish to bridge under the pipeline to allow the water to flow from one side of the pond to the other when there's a flood. There's some key benefits to this scheme here. Number one is one large pond. Number two, you want to go to the next slide? Number two, it reduces the cost because they can backfill some of the holes that are out there right now that have been dug down to like -3 feet. And it would meet the original conceptual project retention and the concept of one pond. And we could put it at 3.5 foot elevation where it required no pumping and would drain itself. It would also minimize the number of feet of levee, less maintenance, no interconnecting pipings between all these different modules of ponds. It's more aesthetically pleasing, and the pond bottom could be utilized for agricultural purposes like hay. It could possibly, with a little creative negotiation, lease it to a farmer in exchange for mowing the levees, okay? And sale of the remaining parcels on the site to a developer could help the parish recoup some of their cost on this. And then if they built a subdivision out there, have lower tax receipts. We actually did a business case for them, a 10-year business case. And the net present value of the business case was like $2.5 million worth of tax receipts. All right, well, the rest of the story is, let's go to the next. This is the evidence about the 3.5 foot. The river frequently goes below that, and it would self-drain. We presented this in a meeting, this drawing, this concept in a meeting with Public Works during the week, and they loved it. They thought it was great. It was a game changer being able to remove or get rid of the flow lines for the orphan wells. We've since talked to Senator John Paul Cousson, who used to be chair of the Department of Natural Resource Committee for the House, and he's already working on trying to move these wells to the front of the queue for abandonment. So we have any call-in? We have a call-in number up there, David, if people want to call in?
One off the air, 90 seconds.
Yeah, we got off.
90
Yeah.
seconds, we can take a call or
We'll
two.
take a call right now.
Yeah.
Take a few minutes.
Yeah,
So they have to fill 6.5 feet for 90 acres? If
yeah.
those
well,
ponds
they
are
got-
at -3, so if you're gonna go to +3.5, you have to fill 6.5.
So-
Any idea what this project will cost?
We ain't got that far yet, but this has been reviewed with the parish, with the engineer, and the engineer blessed it before we went to the parish with it. And so there's about a $5 million opportunity by selling the property and have Orem tax receipts for 10 years, recouping some money on it.
What portion of the property are they selling?
It's marked on that drawing. If you back up to that
That's
drawing
the
there,
portion that's close to the road where they've stocked a lot of spoil right now?
there is spoil on a lot of that land. Yeah. Yeah. And there's questions about how we're gonna deal with that. They might be able to build on top of it, go back if you can.
They build nice and high.
They build nice, they do that all over the parish already. One more. There's about 90 acres of land left over that could be utilized for development.
This one.
No, back up one more.
It shows the pond, so.
Shows the pond, yeah.
Back up again. again,
That right
Yeah,
there.
right there.
Yeah, each of the parcels are identified in this drawing. You know, and some of them, there are some pipelines that run through the area there, that you can't do anything with. These are interstate pipelines. But there are still significant amount of acreage left that could be used for development. They couldn't really build any subdivisions in the Milton area because they had no potable water capability, but now they're getting a new municipal water system.
20 seconds.
So that brings us to the end. So progress is being made on this whole flood control, hopefully to avoid a repeat of what happened in 2016. Nobody wants to see that happen again, but enough steps have been taken. So Dave, thank you for that presentation, and thank you so much for being here.